Well, good afternoon. I'm Father David. Thank you for joining me today for Disciple Time as we're moving into the fifth week of Lent. Can you believe that? Well, this week at Holy Communion, we are focusing on temporal things are transcended by eternal things. So that's temporal things are transcended by eternal things. And I think this is an important thing to consider, especially in light of some of the things that happen in our lives and the ways that some temporal things, like financial difficulties, vocational difficulties, relational difficulties, health difficulties, and basically how all these things can really occupy our minds and our hearts with worry, with fear, and with physical suffering. Life can get hard. And in those moments, those temporal things that I mentioned can become the totality of our focus. And we've all been there, I think. And in the gospel reading today, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and he just tells them right there in John 8:21, I am going away and you will look for me, but you will die missing the mark. Where I am going, you cannot come. And after Jesus says this, the Pharisees start thinking that Jesus might be contemplating maybe taking his own life. But in fact, Jesus is pointing out that in their very worldly oriented state of consciousness, that very temporal focus, where the ego and our desire for power and all this stuff kind of ramps up, they were unable to see past those temporal things, their immediate world setting, to the eternal kingdom. And so Jesus is trying to pull them out of that temporal focus and to put their minds and hearts on the things of heaven. And so we see in John 8:23, Jesus says, you belong to what is below, I belong to what is above. You belong to this world, but I do not belong to this world. So we see Jesus all through his ministry. He's trying to orient people to eternal heavenly kingdom things and to allow those things to be brought down from heaven and kind of played out in earth, like the loving compassion of God to just play out, to overrule the temporal stuff, right? So we see that. And let's just be honest and sympathetic, though, with the Pharisees for a minute, okay? And, sometimes we don't do this, but we need to kind of put ourselves in that position, right? When we're faced with serious temporal issues like health or vocational issues or relational issues, when these things are becoming very serious in our life, they tend to keep our consciousness kind of looped in. And so our internal dialogue just keeps going over these things over and over as we kind of stress about them. And I think it's in those moments that we naturally, kind of due to the circumstances we might be in, we get caught up in ourself, right? And I can recall just about every major trauma in my life and how I would get in my head and in my heart kind of caught up in it, and how difficult it is to not be constantly wrapped up in those feelings and those thoughts, or what I just said, in yourself. And that's not wrong, okay? It's our human condition. And so with that in mind, what then might be the means by which we might be able to transcend that, and enter into the kingdom of heaven, to focus on the heavenly things and kind of incarnate and manifest that love and compassion and patience instead of the worry and the fear and the anger and all that stuff. And Christ is the answer to that question, right? So here and now, amidst our trials and tribulations, the answer is we can transcend that temporal stuff through Christ. Christ is the key to shifting our focus, and Christ is the key to accessing kingdom, eternal consciousness, so to speak. And so we read in John 8:28 and 29, when you lift up the Son of Man, then you will realize that I am, and that I do nothing on my own, but I say only what the Father taught me. The one who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone. So I think today's gospel reading, it speaks very well into our current study of like transcending things. In this case, transcending earthly, temporal things with eternal things. And I think the key, right, is to recognize that Christ in our readings is pointing us to the cross, okay? That is a key thing. That place where he was going to go and suffer, and he would be put on the cross, nailed on the cross for the sake of all humanity. And so Christ is our example because he willingly chooses not comfort and ease of living for the, but he chooses suffering. And that is a selfless act. And what an eternal focus to be in the midst of all that pain and agony that we would endure that and yet still choose to press on with God's will for our life, which is what Jesus did. And to give his life for the sake of others, how that played out. And we all have a cross kind of to bear in the world, right? And we can choose to stay on that cross or to walk away from it. But this was the radical thing that the Pharisees and Jesus' disciples just couldn't wrap their minds around. They wanted honor. They wanted recognition in the synagogues and in the community. They wanted the best seats at the dinner tables. They wanted the power to tell other people what's right and wrong in God's eyes. They wanted influence in every social circle they walked into. They wanted control. They wanted power. And all these things, right, are motivated from a selfish, temporal mindset. And there's Jesus, right, telling them he was about to be killed, put on a cross, and would willingly suffer on that tree so that others might be able to comprehend the way to heaven through him and his example. Wow. And so in this reading, we see that the eternal mindset, right, it lifts our hearts and minds out of a selfish focus. And it lifts us out of a temporal kind of me mentality and sees the cross of suffering as something that transcends all of that. And that is something that in the midst of it all, God the Father, our Creator, even on the cross, is with us. Because that's what Jesus said. Like, even in that situation, we're not abandoned, we're not alone. In fact, through the cross of suffering, we gain an insight into Christ that we wouldn't get had we had a life that had no suffering and no temporal issues in it, right? So the idea here is we don't run away from our temporal issues. The idea is we accept them, but we look to Christ to transcend the suffering that might be involved with them. And just like, in the case of Christ, God can use everything, even our suffering, to usher in his will and kingdom. And we've talked about this before. I don't think God brings suffering into our life, but he strengthens us for the suffering that we face as we live in a world that's just full of, selfishness and temporal things. And so what is at the foundation and base of the suffering? Well, I can tell you this much. It wasn't for nothing, right? At the base of Christ's suffering is love itself. God's love for all of us. And I love that verse from Romans 5:8. But God demonstrates his love for us, and that while we were still missing the mark, Christ died for us. And so what is the application there? I think it is this, May God help us in our suffering to realize God's presence and continued will for our lives, because sometimes we have to embrace suffering to fully live in to God's will. Because the suffering, like I said, it's not maybe something God brings, but it comes as the world, interacts with you. And so being able to accept that and move forward and try to transcend it and let the love and compassion come through all that is one thing I see today that is a key to all this. So thank you for joining me today in this 5th week of Lent. I pray that you are enjoying this time and getting ready for Holy Week, where we will celebrate the resurrection that comes after the suffering, the rebirth and the good stuff. So have a blessed day. We will see you next week.